Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Today is the feast of Christ the King, the last Sunday of the church year. It is a day when we show an alternative to kings, queens, and emperors of history. A day to love and seek justice for all people. I was surprised when doing research on this day that it was not in our 1928 prayer book, but added in the 1979. I found that Pope Pius XI instituted the feast day in 1925 to remind people of the importance of a spiritual ruler instead of earthly ones. Next Sunday begins Advent, and before you know it, Christmas will be here. Today I am going to talk about what kind of king we are celebrating. King of what? When we close our eyes and think about a king, what do we see? Probably a man with a crown full of jewels and maybe a staff of some sort sitting on a throne. Unless you think about King Charles, and that's a whole different story. In today's gospel reading, Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" This question is kind of like asking your teenager how his day was when he walks in the door. Either one of these questions cannot be answered simply. Jesus could have just said yes, and your teenager could have answered fine, but there's so much more to be known. Jesus shifts the question back to Pilate and said, "Do you ask this question on your own, or do others tell you about me?" Pilate responds that he's not a Jew, pointing out the fact that Jesus' own nation and chief priest handed him over and wants to know what he has done. If Jesus admits he is the king of the Jews, that makes it political, which could quite possibly start a rebellion. But he answers in a spiritual way. My kingdom is not from this world. Jesus knows that people are drawn to him to receive divine love. If Pilate is asking this on his own, he could be drawn into that love. For Jesus, the kingdom symbolizes God's ultimate values, God's desires and hopes for the world, i.e., you and me. It could be that this is not Pilate's question at all. Maybe he heard it from others, and he's just trying to figure things out. Jews are not the only ones that are attracted to Jesus' teaching, and maybe the title, King of the Jews, is code for unmatched importance of the great love Jesus shows. Pilate is simply trying to understand all of it. Jesus' own people told Pilate about grounds to execute him. Jesus expands his words by saying, if my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. This only confuses Pilate more, and he asks Jesus, so you are a king? Jesus doesn't exactly answer that question either. Instead, he replies, you say that I am a king. He was born into this world to be a king of living into the truth. And everyone who belongs to this truth will hear his voice. Jesus tells Pilate that he isn't after a throne. It isn't a title for Jesus. It is about truth. Jesus testified by doing, loving, forgiving, welcoming, healing, and feeding. The world during that time was a social, political kingdom that was built on violence and force. Doesn't that sound kind of familiar? highest member of the world separated from fighting. Pilate cannot see the difference between an earthly kingdom and a divine one. He is only thinking of what he knows. He only heard the word kingdom and wants to know what that means. Those who are focused on political power cannot always understand Jesus' spiritual depth. This is exactly why Pilate cannot understand. King to Pilate means political power, and king to Jesus is spiritual. Jesus is living against force in his way. The parable in Luke 22 tells of Peter cutting off the ear of a servant of a high priest. And Jesus says, "No more of this." And he heals the man. This is the kind of king it symbolizes commitment to love all, enemies included. If he belonged to a violent world, he would have condoned Peter's actions and the actions of those in all kinds of violence. Jesus is not just a revelation of divine love. He is a revelation of unknown territory in our hearts. Not agreeing to a force also includes not making threats. Just as Jesus is a different kind of king, he is asking us to be a different kind of people, a different kind of community. He calls us to welcome the stranger, be open to all people, no matter their stories, their experiences, traditions, race, or social status. We can all learn from the trust that comes from this kind of welcoming. We have the promise that Jesus is with us wherever we are and whatever we are doing. In our Episcopal tradition, we have community and worship. We have the Book of Common Prayer, beautiful music, and we have one another. We have our own stories, family, and neighbors. We have love. In fact, we have everything that matters, or do we? Are we living into this model that God expects of us? Are we truly celebrating the feast of Christ the King by living into what Christ expects of us? Are we going, and as we go into the Advent season, let us all reflect on what is really important in this world. Instead of all the political turmoil of the rulers of this earth, focus on the spiritual one, our holy, loving, and perfect Christ the King.